I want you to listen to me. I'm going to say this again.
The president adamantly denies the allegations.
There were always narratives of secrecy in this relationship.
There were other women.
Bill Clinton harassed me and told me, let's keep this between ourselves.
This was a flirtation which was escalating.
Every day is a cliffhanger with this administration.
The day after the election, there were people that I was associated with who were dedicated to upending that administration.
Republicans were salivating.
The thing that's painful is that 20 years later, we are still paying the price for that story.
Two men stepped forward and flashed their badges at me.
I kept hoping that he wouldn't dare cross the line into perjury, period.
The House is exhibiting articles of impeachment.
Bill Clinton handed the sword to his enemies.
What themes of the Clinton era, in your opinion, are still resonating today?
Well, I think obviously the first one is a Me Too theme, which played out in a whole host of ways with Monica, with Paula Jones, with some of the other women. I think, gosh, there's so many. As soon as I started doing this, I realized this is much a series about what's happening today as it is about what was happening back then. And so I think kind of everything we're experiencing now, we were just talking about the release of the Mueller report. You know, when the Starr report came out, there's all this footage of vans pulling up to Congress, taking out boxes and boxes that are the report, and Congress released it within, I think, 24 hours. And then it was on the internet, available for everyone to read. So it's, I think it was a lot more relevant to what's going on today than I thought.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, and with a reverse today, we'll see how many redactions now of the Mueller report we're going to see. And I think the other thing that Blair captured so well in this was kind of the origin story of this kind of hyper-partisan atmosphere in Washington, where it's not about we disagree with the other side because we don't, agree on the issues. It's like the other side is evil, and we're going to do anything we can to take them out.
Monica Lewinsky, obviously a linchpin here, but tell us about landing her. Was that hard? And if you couldn't get her for the series, does the series still go on? Do you still make the series?
I think the reason for making this series was because Monica did agree to talk, and I think she knew that this was an anniversary. Last year was an anniversary year, and she knew things were going to be done. And one of the things that had concerned Monica at the time and haunted her ever since was the idea that during that process, for legal reasons, her voice was taken away from her. And she always felt very strongly about that, and to a large extent, other people defined that era, even though she was so much a part of what was happening. So she thought if she could find the right vehicle, that she would want to participate in something. And so I was introduced to her by an executive producer I'd worked with on another film, and began to talk to Monica. And she also, to her credit, felt very strongly about being in a series that was not just about her, but that set that story in a much broader context. And she agreed to come and speak honestly and speak often. How many hours of interviews did we do?
We did over 20 hours over the course of 3 separate interviews, and it was very interesting because the first interview we did was just on, I think it was just on the cusp of the Weinstein story breaking out. It was either just prior to or very early days of what we now call the Me Too movement. And so from the time between the first and second interview, so much had changed. And then the time between the second and the third interview, so much had changed. And she was sort of personally kind of rethinking her own story throughout this time. So we were lucky the span was probably over a course of a year that we did these interviews.
In talking to her, anything interesting come up that you had known before about their relationship?
Well, there was a lot. I'll let Blair expand, but the one thing that was really interesting to me was getting a sense from her, and she was able to detail it quite effectively, that the narrative that we thought about in terms of the affair, had been a kind of servicing affair, oral sex in the Oval Office. But in fact, it was a relationship, and it was a relationship that involved a lot of phone conversations. It happened over a long period of time, And so that was a kind of, that changed the narrative for me in a lot of ways.
Peter Baker, who was covering the story for the Washington Post at the time, told me they had a conversation in the newsroom. They were going to refer to it as a tryst. And then when they found out there were gifts exchanged and phone calls, they said, okay, no, we're going to refer to it as an affair. And I thought that was so interesting and important. And it truly is an affair. It is an actual relationship.
And the other interesting thing, if you could expound on for those that haven't seen it, she had an inside perspective of things that were going on in the White House. I mean, some hot topic stuff, national headlines.
She's a very smart, savvy woman. And I think, honestly, and I've said this to her, I'm not sure I thought of her as particularly all that smart and savvy, having lived through that period of time. And it was just sort of more motivation for me to portray her, I think, as she truly is, and as someone who was so pillared by the media at the time that we didn't even begin to know who she was. And it was a lot of kind of peeling back all these layers. She's very smart.